Hi, in this lecture, we are going to start our study of the female reproductive system by looking at the anatomy. Now, when we look at the female reproductive system, we pretty much know the main functions are to produce the sex hormones and the gametes. Remember, the gamete is going to be called the oocyte. We also know that the female is going to protect and support the embryo during pregnancy. The fetus will develop, the embryo will turn into a fetus and develop and grow inside mom's uterus. And then after birth, we know that we have breast milk, which is critical for nourishing that child. Now, when we look at the organs, we still have our sex organs as far as our primary versus accessory. The primary are the ovaries. So you can see the two ovaries here. And again, their job is to produce the gametes. The accessory's job is to move that oocyte out. So it's going to be transporting it from the ovary. You can see it going through these uterine tubes into the uterus. We also have the vagina and then the external genitalia. Now, the female reproductive system is completely internal, and it has a lot of ligaments that are very important for helping to support it. There are three that are on your practical. The broad ligament is this really big sheet-like ligament. You can see it really helps hold that uterus in place. And then we have the ovarian ligament, which is running from each ovary to the uterus. So that's going to help support the ovary. And then you're also learning something called the round ligament, and the round ligament actually runs from the top. It's called the fundus of the uterus, and I'll show you that in another view. So obviously there's many more ligaments and tissue that's critical for holding and keeping these organs in place. And if those tissues should fail, you could get what's called prolapse. And so you can have a uterine prolapse where it basically drops. If you don't have enough of those pelvic floor muscles and ligaments and tissue, it can actually drop. Now, the ovaries, remember, are going to produce the gametes, and they do get their blood supply from the ovarian artery, and then you can see the ovarian vein. So in this picture, number 5 is on the right ovarian artery, and number 6 is on the left ovarian vein. So they are important in that blood supply. And then we also know, if we look in here, you can kind of see the ovary on the torso. It's the yellow structure. So as we said, they make the gametes. They're going to produce sex hormones, mainly estrogen and progesterone. And they also make inhibin. And inhibin is called inhibin because it inhibits FSH. Now, you'll learn more about producing these gametes in the physiology lecture. But just to note that a female fetus, a baby, is born with all of her gametes already made. They actually already started meiosis in utero. And then once a month, they're going to mature once she hits puberty. The male, remember, is different. For the male, they don't start making sperm until puberty. So we're going to make the gametes, mature the gametes in the ovary, and now we're going to move into the accessory organs to try to get these eggs out. So we start with the uterine tubes, and these uterine tubes are smooth muscle tubes. They're about 5 inches long, and their job is to move that egg, that oocyte, from the ovary, which here is number 8, and to move it through the tube to get it to the uterus. Now, each uterine tube has 3 pieces to it. The first one is out here. It's this hot pink color called the infundibulum, this whole thing. That's right next to the ovary, and it has these long finger-like things called fimbriae. Now, the fimbriae, it looks like they touch here, but they actually don't touch. They do not come in direct contact. There's a little space there. So when that oocyte leaves the ovary, it has to be sucked up into the fimbriae so that it can be moved through the uterine tube. And since we're looking at peristalsis, once we get in the tube, that's how we're going to move it through. Remember that smooth muscle. Now, the ampulla is number 5. It's the curved portion. It's considered the middle. This is where fertilization usually occurs. So those sperm have to go up the vagina, up the uterus, go into the correct uterine tube, and come all the way out here to the ampulla. Now, as we move closer to the uterus, we have what's called the isthmus. And that's the portion that's right next to the uterus. So as I mentioned, we have smooth muscle and peristalsis. So that's important for helping to pull that egg. Again, you can see here that they don't come in direct contact. There's a small space, and there will be fluid and cilia that are going to help suck that egg up into the fimbriae. And then once it gets moved in, it's going to be transported all the way to the uterus. And it takes a few days for that to happen. Now in this picture, again, notice that if fertilization is going to occur, it's going to happen in the curved part, the ampulla. And then as it moves to the uterus, it goes through all those stages you learned in Bio 119, where you start to form a solid ball of cells. And once you get to the uterus, it will implant. And we don't go over that because you already learned that. So let's look at the uterus. You can see here the rectum and the anus, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. And here's the uterus with the vagina. So the uterus, notice it's anterior to the rectum. It sits posterior to the urinary bladder, a little superior. It's kind of a pear-shaped organ. It's a lot of smooth muscle. It's pretty thick. And as we mentioned, you have these ligaments and pelvic floor muscles that are very important in supporting that uterus and not letting it prolapse or drop. When we look at the uterus, we have three general pieces to it. And so if we go to this view, you're going more at an anterior view, you have the body, which is the main part. Maybe you can see how it kind of looks like an upside down pear. The fundus is the superior portion. This is where you can see where that isthmus, right, from the uterine tubes, they come in and attach at the fundus. And then you'll have the cervix, which is the inferior portion. And notice the cervix actually protrudes into the vagina about 1/2 inch. Into the vagina. Now, if we look at the cervix, so it's the inferior portion of the uterus, we'll notice that it has a couple of things to know. One is called the cervical os. So there's actually two. There's an internal and external. We're just learning the external os. And so if you were to look at the cervix, if you're doing like a vaginal exam, you would see the little os is this little divot. It's a little opening in the inferior portion of the cervix. And you can palpate that. And that's where, ultimately that's going to thin and open up or efface for childbirth. And then that has to open up as well when you have your menstrual flow. And then you have the little os, and you have this little tiny space here. It's called the cervical canal. So here it's calling it endocervical, but cervical canal is fine for that. So the os opens up into the cervical canal. And again, the cervix is part of the uterus. Now, cervical cancer is a reproductive cancer, more common in younger women. This is why you get a pap smear done. So when they go in and do an exam, I kind of circled the area, they go on the cervix, and you can kind of see the changes that are happening here as we go through and look. I'll take my things off so you can see it. And so the idea is if you catch it early enough with the pap smear, you can pick up what's called dysplasia. And so you might have cervical dysplasia. And remember, that's not cancer. That's pre-cancer. So they're starting to see some changes. So they might go in and laser that off. But if you don't catch it, that cancer can spread, and then it can go up into your uterus. And then it can also metastasize in your body. Cervical cancer is associated with the human papillomavirus, HPV. This is sexually transmitted commonly, and a lot of times you wouldn't even know you had it. And with all other cancers, smoking is going to increase your risk. So it's very important to get your pap smears done so that you can look and catch this early. You can see some of your signs and symptoms if you were to have cervical cancer. So it's just something to make sure that you are basically do your preventative work. If we look at the lining of the uterus, there's 3 layers to the uterus. There's the outer part, which is called the perimetrium. And then there's that really thick myometrium. That's all that smooth muscle. And the inside of it is endo, means within. That's the endometrium, the inner lining. And that has a layer called the stratum functionalis. That's the layer that becomes thicker. More blood flows into it each month. And so as it flows in, it thickens. And then if you don't get pregnant, that's what you shed in your menstrual cycle. And you might see tissue. It's that lining of it. And then if, just a shed, if you become pregnant, it's thick because that's where that zygote, as it replicates, that's going to implant. You might remember the term blastocyst. So you need a nice thick vascular layer for a pregnancy to occur. And we don't go into it much in this class, but that endometrium layer, that can grow outside of the uterus, and that's when you hear endometriosis. So the vagina is the birth canal. It's a tube, basically a thin It's the elastic tube between the urethra and the rectum. It basically connects your cervix to the opening to your reproductive tract, which is called the vestibule. I'll show you that later. And obviously it's going to stretch because this is where you're passing your menstrual fluid when you have your period. This is for intercourse, for receiving the sperm and the penis. And then it forms the birth canal. So for a vaginal delivery, that's what that baby is coming out of. Now, we mentioned that the cervix projects into the vagina. So in this picture, here's the cervix and it sticks into the vagina. And there's a little space all the way around the cervix. It's called the fornix. We're not memorizing anterior posterior, but it's a small space or recess. You can palpate your cervix. This is what they do during an exam. So you'll feel the cervix, the Oz, and then there's a little space all the way around it, and that's called the fornix. If we take a quick peek at the female reproductive model now, again, notice you have the rectum and the anus, the urinary bladder with the urethra, and now we see that uterus and we see the vagina. Now in this model, this lighter flesh colored is the perimetrium, and this whole part here is the fundus. The red is the myometrium, and then you can see that kind of flesh colored endometrium. I can see the body is the main part, and this whole area down here is the cervix, and that little hole or space, that represents the external Oz. And then you have the little cervical neck, and these are the fornix that you can see a piece. On this model, the ovary looks white, and you can really see those fimbriae there, those finger-like projections there, and you can see a piece of the uterine tube in this image. So if we were to look at the vestibular glands or Bartholin glands, there are no glands inside the vagina. The glands are actually found on the outside, and you can see them here called vestibular glands. And these are the glands that make mucus, which is important for lubrication during sexual intercourse. So they're on the outside, notice. And in fact, this view, what you're looking at, is considered the vestibule. It's just kind of the opening to the vaginas in here. And so we can see those glands. And the other thing is, obviously your vagina has an outside opening. So anytime we have an outside opening, we need to have protection. And so what happens is you have lactic acid, which is produced, and it keeps the pH pretty low. So estrogen helps the cells of the vagina make the lactic acid, and a lot of it is actually made by the bacteria. So just like we talked about the good bacteria inside the large intestine, there are a lot of bacteria inside the vagina, a lot of this lactobacillus type. And their job is to make this acid. So I kind of joke that you want to have a hostile vagina because you don't want, it's an outside opening. So we need to be protective against any kind of pathogen getting in there and causing infections. But remember that sperm don't like it if the pH is below 6. But that vaginal pH is pretty low. That's why semen is so critical, because remember, when the male ejaculates, it's semen and sperm that get deposited inside. And so those semen are there to help keep that pH so those sperm don't die as soon as they get into that hostile vagina. So we know the pH is important. It's protective for the vagina. And as we get older, when a female goes through menopause, you would expect to have differences basically decrease because that estrogen is so important. And then also, if you go on any kind of antibiotic, you can wipe out these bacteria. And anytime we decrease the number of bacteria, we can allow other types of organisms to multiply. And so vaginitis, itis just means an inflammation of. So it's an inflammation in the vagina. Women are typically going to have it at least once during their lifetime because you can see all the different things that can cause it. Commonly, again, taking an antibiotic and getting a yeast infection can cause it. A lot of times with vaginitis, you'll have more secretions. It might be more thick and white and smelly. There can be bacterial from a pathogenic bacteria. It could be an autoimmune. It could be hormonal. You could have it just because you changed your detergent and you're using a different detergent. So when we look at the reproductive system, there's the hymen that you've probably heard of. So the hymen is it's leftover tissue from embryonic development. And it's a real thin membrane that it doesn't block the whole vagina, by the way. It's usually just a little piece of membrane that surrounds it. They're different in all women. They can be different shapes. Often you see this kind of O shape. And so the idea is, you might have heard before, like, you know, when you're a virgin and you have sex, you bleed. That's not true all the time, because one, your hymen might be smaller. And it can break from putting a tampon in. It can stretch a little bit, or horseback riding, or, you know, exercise. There's all sorts of things that can actually kind of like thin it out or break it. I don't want you to think that's this whole blocked membrane and it just tears. Just over time, it just starts to stretch out and disappear. You can look in a mirror and see if you have any of it left over kind of at the inferior portion of your vagina. But it's something that's different. It has no function, and they think it's just leftover tissue from development. Now, the vulva is the whole area of the female external genitalia. And the vulva has the mons pubis, and so this is the fatty pad over the pubic bone. And then you have the vestibule, which is this kind of like pink area. So the vestibule, like I mentioned, is the opening to the female reproductive system. And when we look at it, we have these labia. So you have that the vestibule is technically the area between the labia minora. These are the smaller folds inside. And then it has the opening to the urethra. You can see the urethral orifice. That's where you're going to put your catheter tube. So it's basically just, you know, covered with these labia. Now, the labia minora is the smaller one that basically folds and covers the vestibule, and those are hairless. The labia majora are the bigger folds of skin, and they usually have pubic hair on them, and the labia are the female counterpart to the scrotum, whereas the clitoris is the female counterpart to the penis. And the clitoris is vascular. It becomes engorged with blood when during sexual intercourse and when you're excited. And it's basically, you'll see there's these little extensions off the labia that form a little like prepuce or hood over the clitoris. And then we have the perineum, which is just the area between the vagina and the anus. And I'm mentioning that because during childbirth, you know, this area will stretch quite a bit. But if there's a problem, they might have to cut that. And that's called an episiotomy. And again, they would cut it because if it tears, it's going to be a more difficult healing process. And then we have the mammary glands, which we know are going to produce the breast milk. So we call that lactation. We know they're under control of prolactin. Remember, that's a hormone from the anterior pituitary gland that causes lactation. Now, males and females do have mammary glands, but they're only functional in females. It'd be kind of cool to see a bunch of men standing around breastfeeding their baby. We know that they're obviously in the chest, and you have the fat pads below it. And then we have the nipple, which is the opening. And that's going to have these ducts that we'll look at shortly. And then the areola is the red-brown skin pigmented area around the nipple. So if we look inside the breast, you're going to have lobes, but we're going to call these lobules. They kind of look like clusters of grapes here. And so these are the glands that the lactiferous glands are going to make, or mammary glands, milk. So as they produce breast milk, that milk is going to drain through ducts. These are exocrine glands. And so the ducts are draining the lobules, and then the ducts dump into sinuses. So the sinuses, you can see, are a little bit bigger. So it goes, the lobules are going to drain the milk into the duct. The duct drains into the sinus, and then the sinuses all collect and excrete that milk out through the nipple. And in this image, this is from your lab manual, you have this picture, and then you have this one from your textbook. Again, you can clearly see the areola and the nipple, and then these lobes look like kind of like lobe or lobule. I don't care which one you call it. And then you have the ducts. The ducts drain the lobule, and then they converge and drain into a sinus, and that's what's going to excrete the milk out the nipple. So when we look at breast cancer, we do know that that is a leading cancer cause. It's a cause of death in women, usually 35 to 45. It does tend to increase over the age of 50. There's a lot of risk factors for this. We know it's genetic. You can actually get tested for these two genes, BRCA1 and 2. And they cause 10% of all breast cancers. So you might have heard of, I think Angelina Jolie did it, and other people who got tested and had these genetic markers. And if you have these genes, you're pretty much guaranteed that you're going to get breast cancer. So some women will have mastectomies in advance to prevent from getting the cancer, because we know that there's a lot of lymph nodes around the breast, and the concern is if you don't catch it early, it can metastasize. And unfortunately, we know that when it metastasizes, it's fatal. And so your 5-year survival rate, if you catch it early, right, it hasn't spread yet, that means you'll be alive in 5 years, is 99%. But if it spreads, the chances of being alive in 5 years is only 26%. So you can read through some of the common risk factors for developing breast cancer as well. And these are things that, are somewhat preventable. Watch what you eat, keep your weight down, don't smoke. So that wraps up our lecture on the anatomy of the female reproductive system.